Welcome, everybody. So I'm Sophie Smith, the Assistant Director of York Public Library, and I am so pleased to welcome you to our program this evening about planetary health, the connections between climate change, wildlife ecology, and tick-borne diseases. This talk is part of the climate series that York Public Library and the York Climate Action Plan Steering Committee have put together to explore different facets of climate change in the months leading up to the town's spring referendum, when people will be asked to approve the town's climate action plan that has been worked on very hard over the past year. We've heard about topics like local fisheries and the benefits of saltwater marshes. And in the next couple of weeks, we'll go into different topics like climate change and mental health and the effects of Indigenous climate justice movements with climate issues. There'll be more information about all these programs at yorkpubliclibrary.org/climate, where we have recordings of our previous programs and listings of those yet to come. We are recording tonight's event, and it should be available on our website by the end of the week. By default, I have everybody muted, but when our speakers are ready for questions, please feel free to unmute and ask away. You're also welcome to use the chat feature, and I will pass along any questions that you may have. We're joined tonight by Dr. Meghan May and Dr. William Miller, two scientists working in collaboration to explore the global shifts that have put wildlife and vector-borne illnesses in a new light. Dr. May is a York resident and a professor of biomedical sciences at the University of New England. Her specialty is microbiology and infectious diseases, and the current focus of her research is pathogen evolution and emerging diseases involving bacteria, parasites, and viruses. Let me let this person in. And Dr. Miller is joining us from Grand Rapids, Michigan, where he is an assistant professor of biology at Calvin University. His research and teaching focuses on the relationship between human, wildlife, and environmental health systems, with a specific focus on vector ecology. Now, let me turn it over to the experts so we can learn more about this important topic.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. I think I'm kicking it off for the night. So thank you for allowing me to join you all the way from Grand Rapids, Michigan. Technology is great, isn't it? So thank you for that introduction, Sophie. My name is Dr. Will Miller, and I will be kicking us off tonight. We're going to discuss tonight a little bit about some of the research that Megan and myself, Dr. May and myself, have been doing over the last couple of years, and some of the connections that we've built in this area, focused on planetary health, or One Health, and the connections that we see between environmental change and some of the kind of an overview of some of the research that's been done and the information that we have regarding planetary change and ticks and tick-borne illnesses, with broader implications for vector biology. So maybe just to start this off with an introduction, because this is probably not the tag team that you often see if you were to go to one of our professional conferences, which is one of the things that I absolutely love about our collaboration. And thankful for Dr. May, who was one of my professors at Towson University, where I did my master's degree. So that's been really great to reconnect and be able to continue this work. So our part really has two acts. I'm going to start us off as a wildlife biologist. This is my natural state up in the upper right-hand corner here. That's me diving for large salamanders called hellbenders, or maybe a nicer name is called snot otter, our largest salamander. So my job really is as a wildlife ecologist. But I jumped into this world of disease ecology as part of my PhD at Penn State, where I studied chronic wasting disease, which is what really brought us back together after a couple of years, looking at the relationship that wildlife share with some of the human diseases that we experience, in the case of Lyme disease, experience in relatively, that has very large effects on human populations. So my goal is to provide, in the first half of our talk, is to give a little introduction to the Lyme disease story, which Dr. May will elaborate on a little bit more as we talk about infectious diseases. I'm going to introduce the One Health paradigm and explain what that is in a moment. It has a kind of a collaborative paradigm that brings biological researchers together over these issues of planetary ecosystem and human health. And talk a little bit about my area of interest, which is environmental change and how that influences wildlife, and the reciprocal connections that wildlife, environmental, and vector systems share and how that can affect human populations. I'll turn it over to Dr. May then, who will do a little bit of a deeper dive into infectious diseases, focused primarily on tick-borne illnesses, both past, present, and future. And maybe some of those more, it provides some overviews of some of those more tangible things that we can do to help protect ourselves from these diseases as they continue to grow in the face of a changing climate and expansion of tick populations. So first, I'd like to start my section of the talk off just with some acknowledgements here, because it takes a village for all these things to happen. So first, at least on my end of the call, I'd just like to start off first by acknowledging that my work is done on the ancestral and traditional homes in the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy. My funding is provided by the sources here, which include both internal and external. And this work really couldn't have been done without my awesome team of student researchers, my great collaborators, not only Meghan, but also some of our collaborators at Michigan State and also our regional partners as well. So I like to start this off with a little bit of a story on Lyme disease. And maybe one of the things that I love to show here is while I'm far away from where you're at right now, we share a lot of connections. This is a library talk, so I'm often reminded of Aldo Leopold's writing in his Stan County Almanac, being the good wildlife biologist that I am, and the reflections on the Northwoods connections. If you haven't read a Stan County Almanac, it is a classic in ecological literature, and I highly encourage that to be your next book that you might pick up at your local library. But we all share this connection of being Northwood states. If we draw a straight line from Michigan, if I was to drive straight across Canada, I could be over in York, Maine, within 900 miles. You know, in the grand scheme of things, not too bad, but it's a straight line shot. And there's a lot of similarities between the environment that we have here in Michigan and the environment that you have there in Maine as well. So all of these things connect us together. Now, I'd also be remiss if I didn't take the detour across the south end here and show you my home state, Pennsylvania, where I grew up close to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and South Central Pennsylvania. All of these three places share a lot in common, especially as we think about tick-borne illnesses and some of the public health threats that we face on the landscape. So this is a problem that will connect us all at some level. And we can see that we transition over to just a brief introduction on the Lyme disease problem itself, often referred to as America's mysterious epidemic. Lots of great things come out of the Northeast. If you have the opportunity, New Hampshire Public Radio has a great podcast called Patient Zero, all about the Lyme disease epidemic, and it's a great follow-up to this discussion. I like maps. I'm a visual person. So this map here is showing the Lyme disease problem in 2005, and I have that arrow there pointing to a place that is near and dear to my family's heart. We would often vacation each year in the southern portion of New Jersey. About 2 weeks after returning from a trip one year, I ended up feeling relatively sick, started to feel really tired, developed a fever of 103, and developed a lot of joint pain, which brought me, as a high schooler, brought me into my local physician. A story that has become much more common over the last 2 decades. Fast forward a few decades where I'm at, if we look now at what the problem is, these maps look relatively similar, but I would draw your attention to places like the western portion of Pennsylvania, my current state, which is southern Michigan, and Maine, and compare these two maps together. And what we see are, at least in Michigan here, a northward expansion along the lakeshore. Northern movement of tick populations has inferred by Lyme disease cases across the Northeast. And interestingly enough, and I'll mention this briefly at the end, draw your attention to the southern portion of this range. There is a southern expansion of tick and tick-borne illnesses as well, which has baffled researchers for a long time. So all of this to add, over a 20-year period, a little tiny vector has been able to spread itself far and wide and has become one of the major health issues that we face, particularly in the Northeast and the Midwestern states. Lyme disease is one of the most common vector-borne, well, it is the most common vector-borne illness in the United States. When we talk about a vector-borne illness, this is a disease that is transmitted usually through some type of intermediate vessel, which we call a vector. Often this is an arthropod or some type of parasite that shuttles the disease-causing agent from one compartment of a system to another, usually from, say, a wildlife reservoir, as in the case of Lyme disease, to the spillover effect that we see causing human disease. Lyme disease is the most common vector-borne illness in the United States and is about 10 times greater prevalence than the next most common vector-borne illness, which is dengue fever, which only has about 40,000 cases over the same period in this study. So a significant health hazard that is predominantly centered around 14 states in the Northeast and the Midwest. In Michigan, where I'm at right now, the story is that this disease is still relatively rare in comparison to, say, Connecticut or New Jersey or New York. But over the past 20 years, we've seen a 5-fold increase in our Lyme disease incidence here in Michigan. And by looking at the Maine tracking program in preparation for this talk, we see very similar trends in your state as well. The major culprit here is this player. I've got a big one hanging on my picture in the back there, the black-legged tick, also known as the deer tick or Ixodes scapularis. This is the primary vector for Lyme disease and something that we probably are all familiar with. Very small, multiple different life stages of varying different sizes. I've got the adult here on the left and the nymphal stage on the right, blown up so that we can see them. But they are identified by their black legs, dark colored scutum or that plate that occurs on their back, and longer mouth parts as compared to some of our larger dog ticks. Black-legged ticks are a problem of the Northwoods because they love mixed forests and they love deciduous forest, and particularly deciduous forest field edges. The nymphs actually rely on leaf litter to complete their life cycle. They quest or actively feed down in the leaf litter, in particular looking for things like small mammals. The black-legged tick is really associated with Lyme disease, our most common, but they also vector other diseases as well, which I'll save till Megan's side of the talk. But things like Polasan Virus, some of these emerging infectious diseases that have become really problematic despite their relative rarity on the landscape, just due to the fact that they cause significant harm and damage to those who are affected and have high mortality rates. These ticks have 3 different life stages with differing levels of activity. With the nymphal stage, which is the stage that we primarily associate with Lyme disease due to its relatively small size and difficulty to detect, are more active in the summer months when people are outside and recreating on the landscape. Now, I want to take one moment just to talk about the tick life stage cycle, because this will become important as we talk about climate change and as we talk about diseases in general. The enzootic cycle, or the disease cycle of Lyme disease, is related to a complex interaction between these different life stages and the wildlife hosts and the unfortunate spillover hosts like ourselves that happen to be part of this system. So they have 3 different life stages and they feed once at each of their life stages. And this becomes important, particularly in the nymphal stage for this tick, or the juvenile. It's kind of like the teenager, the angsty teenager stage for ticks. Because this disease actually isn't maintained through transmission from mama tick to offspring. It requires a tick to feed on an infected wildlife host. and then and their larval stage, and then transition into the nymphal stage, where they remain infected and can either infect other mice or go on to infect other hosts as well. So it's actually quite odd when you think about it, because this disease is maintained by this complex cycle that requires this small mammal and larger reproductive hosts than like white-tailed deer and larger mammals later on in life. So again, just coming back to maps, because I love maps. My parents are listening in, and that my love for maps comes from my dad. So he taught me how to do this, and it's led to a career in wildlife ecology. So this is a map of the Northwoods. Northwood states, we see again this problem of expansion. 1996, the yellow counties here are outlining places where ticks might have occurred, but haven't actually been seen to be established. So this really is an estimate of like suitable habitat for different ticks. Fast forward to 2016, and we see a significant transition from available habitat to occupied habitat, with red counties identifying counties where established populations are known to occur. 20 years. 20 years makes all the difference in this world, despite how tiny these things are. In Michigan, where I'm at as well, this trend, we see a general trend of expansion along our lakeshore front due to a combination of invasion history and climatic conditions that made this possible. And the Lyme disease cases that we see here have expanded similarly over the last 10 years as well, representing that this problem is directly related to the expansion of the vector. And that's where as a wildlife biologist, I come into the system, because I know how to study animals, and that's my area. So I love going out and being able to find where these ticks are and determine or to evaluate what type of risk they may play. Oops, sorry, clicked too many buttons. Fast forward even a couple years, the red counties here in Michigan as well are showing a broader pattern. So we go from 2016 to 2021, and almost the entire state has established populations of ticks. Only a few counties remain with slight reported cases or undocumented observations. So for a little tick, this is a fast-growing problem. One thing to remember here as well is that not every tick is created equal in terms of both like the dogs that we have, or like the canids that we have down on the second part here. Golden Retriever is not necessarily the same, has this cute little fennec fox, which ironically is lined up with the dog tick on this picture, which is not necessarily lined up with a gray wolf, which, you know, I like that also lines up with the Lone Star tick. Not every tick is carrying the same diseases. Not every tick is necessarily sharing the same ecology or spreading, but we can infer some similarities between these as we continue to evaluate general patterns for vector expansion. So with that, another emerging concern, particularly within our area, and I think in your area as well, is the expansion of this second very important human pathogen-carrying species, the Lone Star tick, which I like to share similar habitat characteristics. They're generalist feeders, much like black-legged ticks are as well. Although I like to call them these aggressive feeders because they scuttle. If you've ever seen a tick crawl, they generally amble. These guys scuttle. They're really gross. They just like speed across whatever they're trying to crawl on. These are associated with a number of different problems, mainly some emerging infectious diseases that we are interested in, as well as this odd thing called alpha-gal syndrome, which if you've listened in the news surrounding ticks, you might have heard about an infectious meat allergy, if you will, or the red meat allergy. I use the term infectious there loosely, just for the infectious disease expert in the room. This is an allergy that's associated with exposure to particular carbohydrates associated with mammalian meat products, and can cause allergic reactions if it enters the bloodstream. It breaks down in our stomach, but can cause some other issues if it enters the body in other ways. So spread by the thought to be spread by the saliva of this tick. I put this figure up here as well, because much like what we see with the black-legged tick, if you look in the darker areas, that's the 2007 range for the Lone Star tick. And the lighter yellow areas, kind of along the upper Midwest and even into Maine, show the projected distribution in 2011. So this is another emerging concern. We know that this is invading Michigan and the lower portion of the state. And so if you are a meat lover, this is now becoming a growing concern in our areas as well, due to things like alpha-gal and other problems associated with this species. Tick-borne illnesses in a broader perspective, we see some reviews list over 12 major diseases related to ticks, ranging from Lyme disease to Rocky Mountain spotted fever, as well as several emerging pathogen concerns listed down below here as well. For the sake of time, I'm going to leave that for Meghan to talk about in a little bit greater detail. What I want to introduce right now, though, as we transition into thinking about climate change, is this ultimate concept. We see a problem. Ticks are expanding their range. The question now is why and what we can do about it. One way that we can address these issues, kind of in a multidisciplinary collaborative effort, is through the application of what we call the One Health concept, or the One Health paradigm. This is a paradigm that's really been championed by public health, ecologists, and veterinary professionals over the last 10 years, that studies health and focuses on the promotion of health through a unity of practices, both focused on human health, animal health, and environmental health. Seems very pertinent today when we are thinking about a pandemic that is caused by a disease that spilled over from animal populations. The power of this system is traditionally these compartments haven't talked to each other very well. The goal of this paradigm is to bring us together to think about how we can address these problems, not only reactively, but prospectively, through things like environmental surveillance and wildlife surveillance. As an ecologist, I tend to be on the bottom end of this spectrum. I really am interested in how animals and environmental effects influence human health. So working, in my sense, from a bottom-up approach here. My focuses here are largely on the link between wildlife and vectors and the effects that occur due to environmental change. Now for the punchline of my section. Climate change is one of the issues that York Public Library is really highlighting over the next couple of sessions. And environmental change, particularly associated with climate, has been linked to changes in the ecology of vectors like mosquitoes and ticks. I want to recognize that this problem, though, is multifactorial. This is a link from the 2016 Climate and Health Report. This is available through the globalchange.gov website. So this is a US report that looks at some of the components that are influencing disparate health outcomes and poorer health outcomes. And as you can see here, climate drivers are a major thing. When we think about tick-borne illnesses, climate drivers compound and synergize with other effects like environmental change, like changing landscapes, increased fragmentation, changes to wildlife populations, and even social determinants of disease risk as well. All of this change can modulate exposure pathways and risk associated with tick-borne illnesses. Complex problems require complex solutions, so systems approaches like One Health help us to address these issues. So what do we know about climate change and ticks? Coming from these findings, this is a really great document if you're looking for something to read to understand vector ecology, the literature surrounding this in a manageable, tangible way. So I put the key findings of this report related to tick-borne illnesses. Few changes in disease dynamics, but from a vector perspective, my perspective, there is a high probability that there will be a poleward expansion of disease vectors, both ticks and mosquitoes, due to climate change. And climate change also compounds on a number of different factors that may change tick activity and may lead to complex changes in interactions between hosts and vectors that could affect human health. All of this seeks to modulate, or all of this can modulate the risk of pathogen exposure and infection. I just circling here the components of this system that I think about primarily as a wildlife biologist. So what are some of the things that we know about how climate affects ticks? One of the major questions is, what is the change in geographic distribution that we can expect? What changes can we see potentially in the exposure over a long period of time? This is a report that came out in 2022 that actually used statistical methods to look at where ticks occur and then look at the correlates that are associated with that exposure pattern. So I just circled here because we'll see some areas highlighted in other areas where ticks are, the black-legged tick itself is not occurring. This is the range of the native range of the black-legged tick, but we always model this kind of at a global scale due to issues surrounding biological invasions that we're often concerned about. So what do we see with this? Climate change and climate effects have a significant impact on the geographic distributions of ticks. Winter temperatures play a key factor here. Lower temperatures can be limiting. As climate change continues and warmer temperatures occur during winter, this may create situations where we see more suitable habitat further north, where populations would historically be limited. Maximum temperature during the hottest months also limits ticks, in this case in a negative sense. This can reduce survival and reproduction, so ticks may shift the timing of their life history events, things like life stage transitions, activity levels, to match new temperature patterns. We also know that moisture changes and increases tick survival. So changes in precipitation patterns and humidity associated with climate change may also influence tick distribution and potentially lead and contribute to these expansions that we see. These series of maps are from the same report. This map is showing the predicted range due to different climate projections. This is kind of a moderate high climate projection. We see rangeward expansions along the tick's native range, and this is a net overall increase in the range if we look at the amount of suitable habitat overall. Interestingly enough, while there's not a huge amount of change in our really severe climate change models, the native range stays relatively similar. We still see that upwards northern transition. In areas where ticks may invade if they were introduced, like around the equator and Mediterranean climates, we actually see a reduced habitat suitability in those areas, probably due to hotter temperatures and changes in precipitation. So this is a complex issue, and there's not a straightforward way of thinking about it. But really, what I'd like to highlight is this area in the eastern United States, where we see kind of a net positive expansion from the native range of the species, carrying with it that increased risk of exposure to tick-borne illnesses. Really quickly, because I know I'm running out of time, climate change also is important for other vectors as well. These same patterns are also spotted in things like Aedes aegypti, one of our major disease vectoring mosquitoes. Now, mosquitoes have the benefit of being much more mobile, so this spread can be much more dramatic even with those types of species from these southern ranges. So if we think about ticks maybe as dogs, we can think of mosquitoes as the worst case scenario here. They're birds, they get around really easy. But again, recognizing that this is a diverse issue in all stages of vector ecology. Not every mosquito is created equal as well. Really quickly to round out my talk, just to talk about some of the things that this multifactorial issue. Climate is just one factor here. Climate will interact with these other effects that we see, mainly things that affect the wildlife hosts as well. So white-tailed deer tend to be reproductive hosts. They are quite mobile, and they can move across the landscape in relatively high rates. So they could also play a role in spreading ticks between different populations. Birds are long distance dispersers. This is a golden crowned sparrow with a bird tick on it. And we can actually find kind of these one-off events where we see even subtropical ticks showing up in random places, being dropped off by birds. As climate warms, those may become more and more problematic as well. And then as well, the effects of interactions between climate change and land cover change for things like the intermediate hosts in the disease reservoir, like small mammals, as edginess increases on the landscape, as landscapes become much more fragmented, and as climate warms, this may suit some of these species more and allow for greater kind of precipitation across geographic areas. One last thought about here on the Lyme disease wildlife and ticks. I drew your attention to this expansion in 2018 that we saw kind of shifting south. This goes against some of those long-held kind of assumptions about climate, where we see northward expansions. The question is, what's causing this? Well, actually, this is a map of Lyme disease cases. The black-legged tick has always ranged across the eastern United States. What's interesting here, though, is we see a dramatic decrease in Lyme disease cases as we move further south. This is potentially a wildlife effect. One of the hypotheses surrounding this difference is changes in how ticks feed. Nymphal ticks in the Northeast feed on deer mice. This is what we call a competent host for the Lyme disease spirochete, Lyme disease bacteria. Lyme disease grows really well in mice. What it doesn't grow really well in are lizards. And we see kind of a shift to higher rates of feeding and even behavioral changes like questing lower in leaf litter where lizards tend to occur. So this can actually disrupt that all-important disease transmission cycle that we talked about earlier. So just another really cool way that Lyme disease and tick-borne illnesses are linked in different ways to wildlife hosts. To round this out, I would love to just acknowledge all the work that's being done here in Michigan. The goal of my lab over the last couple of years was to do some field surveillance. These are my undergraduate researchers doing their job, doing their work. They worked with me over the summer on this. We're even looking at monitoring different wildlife populations in collaboration with places like Michigan State. And the goal of this is to map the distribution of tick vectors, particularly as they expand north. So as climate continues to warm, as these range expansions continue to occur, we're not only trying to find out where ticks are, but what are some of the causes of these expansions, and what causes are important in our areas. You can be part of this as well. The CDC Centers for Excellence run this cool program called the Tick app. So if you Google this on your phone, just type in the Tick app, this will come up. This is a great way that you can take pictures of ticks and report it to the professionals, especially with things when we're thinking about the expansion of these new species like the Lone Star tick. Knowing where these ticks are occurring, you can be the early detection system for this type of research. And this is run in our area by Dr. Jean Sal, who is at Michigan State University and is a dear friend and valuable colleague in this work, and as an expert in all things Lyme disease. So I put that little plug in there. And as always, if you ever have any questions or you find anything cool out there, if you want to see, hey, what's this? Drop me a line. My email's here, and I'd love to hear what you're seeing. So I think with that, I'm going to save that slide. I'm going to turn this over then to the disease expert to actually talk about the diseases. So thank you for your attention. I'll be back for questions soon.
Great, thank you so much, Will. So I'm going to take a second and share my screen with the 700 things that are open. Okay. So we've just spent a lot of time learning about how and why ticks are changing their density, their population levels, and the geography that we find them in. And we talk about tick-borne diseases, but being myself with a morbid fascination with crazy infectious diseases, I'm going to give you some information that will hopefully make this far more tangible into why it's critically important that we understand these parameters. Okay, so as mentioned, I'm going to talk about where we currently are with tick-borne diseases here in Maine. Then I'm going to talk about some of our future that is immediately upon us with regard to new diseases because of new tick vectors. And I'm going to end by talking about how we can control tick-borne diseases. But that being said, I also want to start with some acknowledgements. All of those ticks that Will and his team are out collecting in Michigan, and also some of the ones that Jean Sauer is collecting, they find their way to my laboratory. We sit in the comfortable air conditioning while those guys are out in the field, doing all the hard stuff. And we sit in our laboratory that's on ancestral Wabanaki land to acknowledge that. And then these guys here extract a whole bunch of DNA and RNA from ticks, which we had developed quite a learning curve for how to actually do that, because ticks are, it turns out, darn near indestructible, and you have to put a lot of really gnarly chemicals on them to get their carapace to come apart. But we finally figured out how to do that. Just to acknowledge, these are my folks that work on this. This is Morgan Robinson, Sean Kalagi, Chrysanthi Lundstedt, Tony Chase, and Gigi Green, who is graduating and becoming a real life physician in 1 month. So yay for her. And she's in charge of my life and manages all of these guys. So I'd be lost without her. Anyway, our present reality for tick-borne diseases is really kind of dominated by these three guys. There are other ticks that we can find in Maine, but these are our most prevalent, and these are ones that we most typically see transmitting disease. The first one is the American dog tick. Surely we've all pulled 400 of these off of our dogs and ourselves or children. Over the past 10 years, we can also recognize that you can almost count exponentially on your hands over the past 10 years how more and more frequently you run into these guys. They are kind of icky and kind of a nuisance, but they're very problematic because they spread two diseases one is called Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever, which despite the name is actually quite widespread throughout the US, and another disease called tularemia. I'll tell you much more about these guys in a second. We also have the woodchuck tick, which is called Ixodes cookii. It, we now have learned, can spread Polasan virus, and we also think it can spread Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever. But the tick we talk most about, of course, is the cousin here of Ixodes cookii, which is Ixodes scapularis, the black-legged tick. And this, I think we've all seen this picture 912 separate times. This was the one that we worry about most in Maine. This is the one we know spreads Polasan, Lyme disease, Babesiosis, and anaplasmosis. You might be wondering what the heck these two things are, because we don't talk about them very much, but we'll learn what they are in a second. Okay, generally speaking, when a person develops a tick-borne disease, most of the people wind up with some version of this series of events. They develop what we call a classic ILI, that stands for Influenza-Like Illness, which is a really fancy clinical term for that patient feels yucky and they are just draggy and achy and they have a fever and they just feel like garbage. They're not bleeding from their eyeballs, they're not coughing out a lung, but they just feel like garbage. Occasionally, they may also have certain types of rashes, but hold that thought. Basically, this is a classic I don't feel good illness, which I do not say to minimize it. Having had Lyme disease myself, it is, you feel awful. I just meant it's a very kind of vague set of symptoms. So tick-borne pathogens that we have in Maine, some of them are viral, some of them are bacterial, some of them are parasitic. If we were live in person in the library, or if I were in class for the med students at UNECOM, I would ask them why this matters, or I would ask you why this matters. But since we're all virtual, I will give the spoiler, which is to say it matters because you treat these three things very differently. So you can't give one medication that's going to cure any and all tick-borne diseases. Okay, so we have our classic presentation of this vague ickiness syndrome, but there are many, many other diseases. We have the infamous one, which is of course Lyme disease. We have the copycat of Lyme disease, which in this case is our friend Anaplasma phagocytophilum. We'll get into what this guy causes more specifically in a minute. We've got a really strange presentation by an organism called Babesia microte. And then we've got a couple of terrifying ones. One from our friend Polasan Virus here, another from a bacterium called Rickettsia rickettsiae. This guy causes our Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And then finally, this fellow over here called Francisella tularensis, which causes tularemia, as you might guess from the name. Okay, so the infamous one, we're all familiar with Lyme borreliosis. Many of us have probably even had it. We tend to have in our head this kind of easy classic version of events for Lyme disease, namely, you wake up, you do not feel good, you have an ILI, and then you get this really wonky rash that looks like a bullseye, so much so that though the official name of this is erythema migrans, we all know it as a bullseye rash. And of course, you recently were bitten by a deer tick, and then you know that you have Lyme disease. The problem with this easy version of events is that it rarely ever happens that way. First and foremost, people think if I don't have this bullseye rash, then I can't have Lyme disease. One of the things that we all need to, that I really like to spend a lot of time harping on is the fact that very close to half of all Lyme patients never get a bullseye rash. So absent, if you have this, great, you know what you have. If you don't have it, that doesn't mean you don't have Lyme disease. So definitely want to seek treatment. However, the other thing is you may say, well, I never got bitten by a tick, so I can't have a tick-borne illness. Well, more than half of people who are diagnosed having a tick-borne illness have no memory of being bitten by a tick. And if you looked at some of those pictures that Will had put up with the actual size of larval and nymph ticks, they're teeny, they're really easy to miss. So those are the ones that actually do the most disease spreading, because if you have a big, giant, honking adult tick on you, you notice it and you pull it off before it transmits anything to you. So very few people actually remember pulling a deer tick off of themselves and then a week and a half later come down with Lyme disease. Okay, however, this easy version, as you could imagine, is not the only version of events. You can miss this first stage entirely and have it left untreated, and then you'll find yourself with big swollen joints. You may find yourself with confusion, with memory problems, with terrible nerve pain, with damage to your eyes, with damage to your heart, and ultimately you can have almost a dementia-like presentation if this invades into the nervous system. Okay, so gotta go through this really quickly. Our primary Lyme disease is we have this acute, I don't feel good itis. You may or may not see that bullseye rash. And this can resolve even if you don't treat it. However, the problem with that is that organism is still in you and it's not gone. So you may think you feel better, but you're about to get whacked with something a few months later. This is where the spirochete is going to spread all over your body, and it can give you arthritis, those big swollen knee joint that we saw in the previous slide, or any other joint for that matter. You will be exhausted. You can have numbness in your hands, feet, teeth. You can have muscle weakness, eye pain. You'll lose memory and be confused. And then you can start having heart palpitations. And then if this isn't recognized as Lyme disease and it still isn't treated, then you can have this late persistent form where you really start having pretty severe neurological problems where you have mood changes and sleep disturbance and memory loss and muscle coordination problems. So suffice to say, if it's summer and you feel vaguely icky, even if you have no memory of being bitten by a tick, you definitely want to go see urgent care or your primary care physician and just have this conversation with them that you do not feel well, you haven't felt well for a few days, and you're worried about tick-borne diseases. Okay. Oh, and one more thing I would be remiss to if I didn't point out that the longer Lyme disease is left untreated, the greater the chance that a person will develop what is sometimes, which is popularly called chronic Lyme disease, but is actually the proper clinical term for it is post-treatment Lyme syndrome. A patient who has been treated and the organism's gone, they at this point may have had so much damage from the disease that the symptoms actually still persist for quite a long time, as though they were still infected. So you don't want that to happen to you. Okay, so who's our copycat? This is anaplasmosis. So the anaplasmosis has this same constellation of symptoms. I woke up one day and it's tick season and I feel like I got run over by a truck. How do you tell it from Lyme disease? So it actually can be quite hard. Anaplasmosis is never going to give you a bullseye rash, but pretty much that's the big physical difference between the two, at least in those early stages of Lyme disease. But the good news is it doesn't actually matter because both of these diseases are treated with the exact same medication for the exact same amount of time. So you can go in with this kind of early vague presentation and be given the same prescription before you know which of these diseases you have, and that's going to work perfectly fine. So anaplasma is a little bit on the vanilla side. It's not that interesting. Let's get to some of the more interesting guys. So our strange one is something called a malaria-like syndrome due to Babesia microte. Before we talk about the weird version of babesiosis, we have to talk about the standard version, which again is this, the vague ickiness syndrome, the I don't feel good itis. Okay, but some people get this malaria-like syndrome. Before we say we should freak out about that, we should probably revisit what is malaria? Most of us have heard of it, right? We know it's an infectious disease. We know it's bad. We know we don't have it in Maine. We know that people get it between the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn. So that's a somewhere else problem. But what does an actual person with malaria look like? How do they present? So malaria is a really, really challenging physical disease. And so what you're looking at here is a really odd graph. And the way that you read this is these numbers here, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the day of the illness. So on the first day, second day, third day, fourth day. And what you're looking at here is a patient's body temperature. And so, and these are the readings from one particular malaria patient, but it's very representative of what these folks go through. So on day one, you wake up in the morning, you have a low grade fever, not that big a deal. And then it shoots up to 104.5 degrees, which is bonkers. If as an adult, you ever have a fever that high, if it lasts longer than 12 hours, you're probably not going to live very long. But what happens here is after a few hours drops back down, then it spikes back up to 103, and then it drops way back down here almost to normal, and then it goes way back up to 104 the next day. So this is a real ringer that your body is put through. To change body temperature that quickly and that dramatically is incredibly, it's incredibly traumatic on the system and stressful to the system. And the way that that happens is like this. So what happens in a patient's bloodstream if they're infected with malaria is the malaria parasite grabs onto a red blood cell. It sneaks inside of it. It starts replicating in there, and then it replicates a whole bunch, and then there are a whole bunch of them in there, and then that red blood cell explodes because it can't hold them in anymore. And then you get a whole bunch of these guys released back into the bloodstream, and then each of these goes and finds a new red blood cell. So what does this have to do with this crazy spiky graph? Is that this bit here is where you see the crazy spike in fever. And then when all of these guys find a new red blood cell and go on the inside, that's when the temperature drops way back down close to normal. And then as this goes on, this explodes and it spikes way back up. Okay, what does this have to do with Babesia? It turns out in certain patients, Babesia does the exact same thing. So if you pull an infected patient's red blood cells out, you can see Babesia parasites inside their blood cells. And then if you watch them long enough, those cells blow up and Babesia parasites go all over the bloodstream, and the patient themselves has a temperature spike way up into well over 103, 104 degrees. And then it falls way back down again. Again, it's incredibly stressful to the body to change temperature like that. So that's odd. Most of us have not thought about having anything like malaria in the state of Maine, but we have an organism endemic here that will do that in certain patients. So how do they look? They have these cyclic fevers, very much like malaria. Patients are usually pale, they're anemic, right? So they have low red blood cell count. You could imagine why, because the parasites are blowing them up. And if all of these red blood cells are being blown up and they're creating a big giant mess in the bloodstream, that's going to have a really difficult impact on the organs that are responsible for cleaning up toxic messes in your bloodstream, namely your liver and your spleen. So these guys, so your liver and your spleen end up getting big and swollen and not doing their normal functions properly as they should. And so this can lead to some pretty bad outcomes for patients. So who gets this? Well, the same high risk, this is actually, this is a graphic who's at high risk for COVID, for severe COVID, but it's the exact same group of patients. So people who are on chemo, who've had transplants, who have uncontrolled HIV, who are taking immunosuppressive medications, and older adults. And in addition to that, people who have lost their spleen surgically, either because they had, perhaps a car accident, bike accident, something like that. People in these groups are at risk for developing this malaria-like illness, which is not something we think about, but it's something we really should think about, particularly given how many ticks we found over the last summer that were actually carrying Babesia. It was a shockingly high number. So that wasn't even the terrifying one. That was just a strange one. So the terrifying one, part one, is this Rocky Mountain spotted fever caused by this organism, Rickettsia. So this is going to kill 1 out of every 4 people who gets it. This is spread by our friend the dog tick and the woodchuck tick to a lesser extent. So these folks get really high fevers, terrible headaches, and they get what's called a hemorrhagic rash. So this is a great example of a spotted fever rash. If you actually took a biopsy of that skin, or even if you just pressed on it, what would be very clear is these aren't rashes like hives. These are actually bits of bleeding under the skin. And it happens because this organism attacks these cells here that line red blood cells, and they basically chew up, not red blood cells, blood vessels, and they basically chew up the structure of the blood vessels. So your blood, instead of being contained in these nice tubes, starts to leak out all over the place. So you can imagine why that would be fatal in a large portion of the time. So I just want to throw this up. This is kind of a separated out version of one of the maps that Will had up. And this is showing, this is our spotted fever disease that we just talked about. This is anaplasma that we just talked about. This is just 1 year of Lyme disease. So you can see that these are far more, Lyme disease is far more prevalent than either of these, but that is changing. Both of these are increasing, and this is increasing as well. And we could imagine why, because we have a higher density of ticks. Okay, our other terrifying one to talk about is Polasan virus. So many of us may have heard of this one. This is the one that sometimes when there's a case, you hear about it on the news. And this causes what's called an encephalitis, basically a swelling in the brain. And I have here 4 images of a brain from an infected patient taken one day after another. The way that you want to read these is black and gray are good colors, white is a bad color, right? So white means inflaming goo that is climbing all over the brain. So longer this goes on, you can see you've got more whiteness, and this ends poorly. When you wind up having Polasan virus in the brain and it causes this inflammation and swelling, you have patients with terrible high fevers, terrible headaches, they become delirious, eventually they become comatose, and a very large percentage of them die. So that's not great. And our final terrifying one to talk about is tularemia. So this is carried by ticks, specifically the American dog tick. And then we've another one that we're going to put a spoiler alert on. You can also catch it directly from small mammals, most notoriously rabbits. This takes a lot of forms. You can have these skin ulcers that eventually they're very painful. They eventually turn black. They're not usually fatal. You can have these big swollen lymph nodes, which are incredibly painful and frequently fatal. So this 15% is an overall. There are some forms that are more fatal than others. And then finally, we have something called Pneumonic Tularemia, which, to give you context for a second, this is what a healthy person's chest x-ray looks like. Same ideas with the brains. Black is a good color, right? If you can see black through the lungs, you're doing good. And this is a chest x-ray from a person with pneumonic tularemia. You see all of this white yuck in there. That's basically fluid and inflammation in the lungs. So that person's not going to be able to breathe very well. Okay, so our future reality, my last couple minutes here, we talked about these guys, and now we have this guy. As mentioned, the Mibleoma americana is on the march, the Lone Star tick. We've for the past several years found 1 or 2 here and there in Maine, probably from travelers or probably from animals moving back and forth. But what we've seen in the past 5 years is suddenly they were endemic all over New Jersey. Then they were all over Long Island. And then they were all over Connecticut and Rhode Island. And last year they were all over Massachusetts. And I would not be stunned if this summer they're all over Southern New Hampshire and Southern Maine. So these guys have a whole different suite of diseases that come with them. So that top one there, Borreliosis, that's another copycat, presents almost exactly like anaplasma or the early stage of Lyme disease. The terrifying piles on because this guy can spread tularemia as well. And we've got 2 terrifying new viruses. They've both been on the news. In fact, of all luck, this was in USA Today, literally this afternoon, or I should say this morning, because it's got a timestamp of 6:40 a.m. So essentially, these 2 new viruses are called bourbon virus and heartland virus. They're spread by this guy. We are in the midst of screening the ticks we got last year for these 2 viruses to see how many are carrying them. The problem with these is there aren't a lot of good tests for either of these viruses yet, and we don't have a great understanding of the entire spectrum of disease. What we know about them so far came from patients who got very sick and died. They had high fevers, they had terrible headaches, they ultimately had encephalitis, and they also had an inability to make blood clots. We think of blood clots as a bad thing, but actually they're incredibly important biologically. If your blood doesn't clot well, you tend to bleed out of all of your orifices, and that ends poorly for you. So these 2 viruses really seem to interfere with that process. And again, most of the patients we see and have a good understanding of have been those that have gotten so sick that they've died. I would venture a guess that it's probable these guys also have very mild forms of disease, but we just don't have a laboratory test routinely available for somebody to check a patient who just has one of those vague, I don't feel good presentations. So that's our past, that's our future. What do we do about this? The first thing I want to emphasize to everybody is that you can get tick bites treated. So if you pull an engorged tick off yourself, call urgent care or call your primary care physician and say, I just pulled an engorged tick off of myself or my kids or whoever, and they can prescribe you a few days of doxycycline, and that will, even if that tick was carrying any of those pathogens that respond to that drug, it will prevent you from ever becoming infected with it. And this is one of those dose of prevention is worth a pound of treatment moments. Nobody likes unnecessary antibiotics, but if you can take 2 days of doxycycline and not wind up with post-treatment Lyme syndrome, well worth it, well worth it. But treating tick bites is great. Preventing tick bites is even better. So obviously you can do that with repellents. If you use DEET, that works best. If you do not want to use that, be very careful about how often you reapply it, because the more natural products tend to have to be reapplied very frequently to make sure they're still present and working. Another huge one is land management and yard management. So as Will talked extensively about habitat fragmentation, if you look at it kind of from an aerial view, so you look at these lovely houses in this beautiful manicured neighborhood, if there's a mouse living right here and it's carrying Lyme spirochete, and first of all, there's nothing else for any ticks around here to bite but those mice. Second of all, there's nothing that is going to pick that mouse out of the ground and eat it. Not to be too morbid about it, but the ticks have nothing to feed on but the small mammals, and the small mammals have no predators. And so fragmenting habitat like this really, really favors tick-borne disease, tick expansion and tick-borne disease spread. If you look at a house like this, which is an absolutely lovely house, I would love to live in it, you see all of this forest over here. And yes, you're going to have mice and small mammals that live there, but you're also going to have owls and falcons and a whole host of competent and non-competent vectors for ticks to spend their time biting. So it's going to dilute out the impact. So even though this looks like it might be more risky for a wildlife disease reservoir to be proliferating, this is actually far worse. If you happen to live in a neighborhood like this, which again, looks like there'd be all kinds of, they would have fun Halloweens and everything else. You can put things like this in your yard. These are called tick tubes. And basically what this is the tube, and there's a whole bunch of snuggly cotton batting in there. And that's treated with an insecticide called permethrin. So what happens here is you put these around the edge of your yard, and mice see all that snuggly material. They go in, they pull it out, they use it to make their nest. And the permethrin doesn't really hurt the mice, but it keeps ticks from biting them because they've essentially had tick repellent put on them. And so that is going to keep ticks from biting them. It's going to kill any ticks that come into the nest. And if you keep putting those out, then that'll cut down the number of ticks that are in your yard. And then finally, a move you can make is to try to add predators to ticks to your yard if it doesn't look like there naturally would be any. So bats are excellent predators of ticks, and mosquitoes for that matter. So bat boxes are really good things to have in your yard. Chickens are excellent predators of ticks. And if you are not feeling predators of ticks, you could always have predators of small mammals. That's my cat Leo. He's an excellent mouser, and he's being cheeky in this picture. I don't know why. And that's all I have to say. We have some really terrible diseases that could become far more prevalent in our neck of the woods. And we should be very careful about and very mindful about making sure that we do everything we can to minimize that possibility. So with that, here's the tick muffin again. And yeah, we think we'd both be happy to take questions.
Thank you. That was fascinating. And I hope everybody feels free to unmute and ask questions or put them in the chat, and I can send them along.
And I very rudely pointed out, Will, when you mentioned the Patient Zero podcast, I went, oh, I was on that.
I missed that.
I put the link in the, I was on the Lyme episode, the vaccine.
Oh, yeah.
Episode, yeah. Yeah. one of my favorite things working with Will as a disease ecologist has been I get to see all those cool pictures of like lizards and birds and, you know, learn who lives next to who and all that kind of stuff that, you know, I miss out on when I'm just in a stupid white laboratory that has no windows.
Well, I will ask a question because I'm regularly pulling tons of ticks off of both my child, myself, and my dog. In terms of like assessing for symptoms or calling the doctor or looking at starting a course of antibiotics or whatever, you're talking about engorged ticks. So something that's more than just, you know, like it was a little bit attached, you still have to pull it out, but there's nothing major. I mean, I'm just clarifying because of course, as a nervous mother, I worry about these things a lot.
Sure.
So
No, it's a great question. And the answer is I usually call regardless if I pull a deer tick off. And the reason for that is we know Borrelia, the Lyme spirochete, at first the thought was, oh, it takes 3 days to transmit. And then it cut down to, it actually might take 24 hours. And then it was, no, it turns out it can actually be within 12 hours. And then Anaplasma and Ehrlichia are actually a bit faster than that. Polasan is much faster than that, but unfortunately that doesn't have a treatment you can, that you can use to prevent infection. But those others, they transmit a bit faster than that. And so usually regardless, if I pull a deer tick off of somebody, I call and get either, there are a few different regimens for prophylactic doxycycline treatment. I'll take whatever anybody's willing to give, but and I actually saw in the chat a question from Sally I had a question about malaria is caused by ticks. I thought mosquitoes. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And I think I said that a little too quickly. So malaria itself, the Plasmodium parasite, that is spread by mosquitoes, and it's spread by mosquitoes that do not live in Maine. So we are not going to see locally transmitted malaria, but what we do have and what is spread by tick is Babesia. And Babesia in a lot of patients, again, doesn't cause this malaria-like illness, but sorry, that was my Weather Channel app. It made it sound like I said something insightful. But what our ticks do carry and can spread is Babesia, which for those groups of patients, so older adults, people on immunosuppressive medications, basically everybody at high risk for COVID is also at risk for developing this form of Babesia that very closely mimics malaria. So sorry if I was not clear on that part.
We have a question here too about turkeys. Do turkeys feed on ticks and reduce their populations like chickens do?
I could probably take that one a little bit, maybe from a slightly different angle, and also a second question in here. Some insight, some very observant member of the group noticed that Massachusetts was missing some of those Lyme disease records on the maps that we were showing. That's likely just a reporting error or some type of reporting glitch. Lyme disease is very much established in Massachusetts. So that was likely, CDC kind of delegates disease surveillance to the states. So it was likely kind of a mismatch in communication there. In terms of turkeys, maybe one thing I'll mention there, Meghan may have an idea on whether or not turkeys kind of substantially feed on ticks in backyards. As an ecologist, though, one thing that we potentially look at is turkeys as potential reproductive hosts of ticks as well. So it may be this kind of dual-edged sword, especially with wild populations of large game birds and birds in particular. probably more in your area than where I'm at right now, can actually be important disease reservoirs for many of the diseases, these vector-borne illnesses that we've been talking about. The Lone Star tick in some circles has also been aptly named the turkey tick, due in part maybe to associations between turkeys and Lone Stars. Lone Stars like to feed on everything. They're we call generalist aggressive feeders, which is also why they are a problem from a public health standpoint. So I would hedge a bet. I don't have necessarily data to support this, so this is anecdote. But I would think that turkeys would likely feed on some insects, potentially ticks, which are not truly insects, but they could potentially feed on ticks. But there is also the role that they may play as hosts as well that we should probably consider. Yeah. Great question.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, and I agree. I'm 99% sure at the very least wild turkeys feed on ticks, and we, as you aptly guessed, have a ton of them around here. In fact, there's a pair that live on the corner of Route 1 and Route 1A, and they're nicknamed our town mascots. We're in the process of naming them. There's a contest on the community page. I don't know if people have seen that, but we've got I've got a wild flock that wanders through the yard and tortures the dog. And there's the wild turkeys will eat them, but again, if they're also amplifying, then it's not quite the same from a bioremediation standpoint as it would be to have a captive, chicken flock in your yard that you can medicate and keep free of ticks, keep them from amplifying tick-borne diseases and have them contribute to the life cycle that way, but you will have them eating them and taking them out of commission. I think.
Yeah, Jerry has a question. Did you want to ask it, Jerry, or I can relay it?
Yeah, I can just ask it, I guess. Is there anything that can be done on a community or municipal level other than, getting the word out in terms of educating the public as part of public health measures? Has anyone tried, I don't know, some sorts of zoning practices that might minimize growth of habitat or things like that?
I can tackle this maybe from the landscape perspective, and Megan, feel free to jump in if you have anything else.
Oh, I got nothing on this one. I'm gonna let you talk about this.
So Jerry, the first line of defense, and really what we're working on here, is again with public health knowledge dissemination in terms of risk mapping. But there is discussion of particular practices that may be helpful in terms of at least reducing densities of ticks. Now, this is an area of active research, so there's some questions about how effective each of these practices are. If you are in a more rural area and ticks are a concern, there may be some evidence that ecological management practices such as controlled and prescribed burns may have a controlling effect on tick populations. This is something that I'm very interested in testing as an ecologist that works with land management agencies to see if this would be a potential way that we could reduce tick densities or even modulate the disease cycle. The other things that are really that there is some hypotheses and some thought around are also how we control the hosts, the normal hosts of the Lyme disease vector. So white-tailed deer are the reproductive hosts, and along with landscape change, which in certain circumstances is an inevitability nowadays. So practices that reduce fragmentation may have some effect there as well, but targeting the host. I work with hunters. I work closely with hunters as a disease ecologist that's studied chronic wasting disease. And deer over at least the last century or two, particularly from the early 1900s, are kind of at record high levels. Deer were almost extirpated off the landscape in the late 18 or early 1900s, along with that expansion of white-tailed deer compounded with these other factors like landscape change and climate has really created the perfect storm of conditions for this issue to expand. So apart from land management, management of wildlife populations and management of the host populations is predicted to have some type of effect. So I do a lot of studies with white-tailed deer in urban environments, and that is one of the things that's almost always talked about kind of ubiquitously across white-tailed deer biologist circles, reducing automobile accidents and reducing the potential for Lyme disease in urban areas. So I know that's kind of a broad spectrum of things that we've talked about. So I'm not sure about zoning practices in particular, but there is questions about what actively we can do, and wildlife and land management are two of the major tools that we have in the toolbox.
Although it occurs to me, management of fragmentation could be a zoning issue.
Yeah.
Just thinking out loud, but.
I kind of doubt locally there'd be a lot of appetite for prescribed burns and introducing wolves to reduce the deer population. So,
well, we can control the deer population in other ways as well. So we are the apex hunter in the system. So hunting practices that facilitate kind of reductions of the deer herd, appropriate reductions of the deer herd, and in urban areas in particular, like where we're at, things even like urban wildlife contraception. This is an actual field of study. It sounds kind of out there, but this is one of the tools that we have to reduce urban wildlife populations, to reduce deer where people are living, to respect the human wildlife interface. And more appropriately, thinking about habitat encroachment. Deer have been here for longer than we have, and respecting that interface is one of the things that we can do, not only to modulate Lyme disease, but to modulate this broader field of zoonotic pathogens that spread from animals to humans or spill over from animal to humans, like COVID. So deer, as a side tangent there, deer are now a potential and significant reservoir for COVID-19 on the landscape. There has been spillover from humans and potential for spillover back. So respecting that interface and thinking about how we as individuals and maybe as homeowner organizations may be able to think through those questions a little more, I think would be, I think it's an important question that you're asking, and it's something that we'd love to talk more about.
Preventing fragmentation, seems like something worthy of taking a look at. I'm not at all familiar with how you'd go about doing that, but it's something to keep in mind, and maybe keep a track of where the research is going on it.
Yeah. Great question, though.
Thanks.
Oh boy.
Are there any other questions in the audience? We put them in the chat or speak up.
I have a question. I think Dr. Miller just said that the deer were carrying COVID. Did you mean Lyme disease, or did you mean COVID disease?
COVID.
I actually meant COVID. So the deer and bats and many in certain animals have really great capacities to serve as reservoirs for different diseases. So I pulled in COVID as another dramatic example of
Pigs too. They're another one.
human wildlife
Deer
connection.
and bats have
Yeah.
incredibly, for whatever reason, they have incredible, incredibly permissive host systems where they often serve as these intermediate roles between, the natural reservoir of some pathogen that none of us have ever met before, and it, becoming a major issue in humans. And as you correctly pointed out, they do amplify and carry Lyme disease. But one of the things that was noted, I think in 2021, we had the first instance of someone detecting SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID, in a deer. And then once that first detection happened, people started looking. And then the more people looked, the more people found. And it seems as though, it's circulating quite effectively in deer at this point. So even if we manage to get it out of the people, it's now at this point, it's established itself in the deer population, which is not great.
And I'd be remiss to say, as a wildlife enthusiast and a wildlife conservationist, that it is very easy for zoonotic diseases to develop kind of an unhealthy fear of these wildlife contacts. So I always like to bring this into this discussion here. Appropriate respect for the wildlife and human interface, I think, is a really important thing, so that deer can be deer, bats can be bats, and humans can be humans. So this is a way that we go about minimizing wildlife conflict and kind of creating these zones of safety for species. Deer, probably not a huge conservation concern. Some of the bat species that we talk about that serve as hosts for these diseases, significant concern about their longevity on the face of the earth. So just as a conservation advocate, I just want to bring that picture into it as well. Yeah.
Well, I really want to take this opportunity to thank both of you for your time this evening. It has been fascinating, slightly horrifying, but truly fascinating. And
that's what we were going for.
We may need to revisit this conversation and make everybody in town listen to it, because I think it's really important information, and I'm really glad that you could be part of our climate series. Like I said to the people at the beginning, we did record this presentation, so it'll be available on York Public Library's website in the next couple of days, and please share it with your friends and family and homeowners associations and everyone who might be, benefit from learning more about this relationship. And with that, I thank you both so much for your time. It was truly an honor to hear all this information.
Thanks
Yep,
for having
thank you very much.
Thanks
Thank
for
you
having
for having
us.
us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a
Good
good
fun.
evening.